Let us understand about twill weave structure today. One of the characteristic features of the twill weave is that it has these very distinct diagonals. And these distinct diagonals, which you see here flowing towards the right, are created by these floats. Let's say the brown threads are the warp, the longitudinal threads, and the horizontal threads are the weft, the picks. If we look at the first pick here, it goes under the two warp threads and then floats or moves over two warp threads and then goes under and then over, which means in twill weave the picks flow over one or more warp threads. Here they are moving over two warp threads. So which means it goes under two warp threads, then over and then under two warp threads. And each pick progressively takes a step further, which means here it was going under the first and the second warp thread. In the second pick, it starts from going under the second and the third warp thread. In the third pick, it begins by going under the third and the fourth warp thread. And that's how we get a very progressive diagonal which flows in this manner. So let us understand the diagonal ribs more clearly by plotting it on the graph. So this brown color pencil represents the brown warp threads. So if we look at the first pick, this is the first pick and I have my first pick here. And let us see how the first pick moves. It moves under the first two warp threads, which means they are visible. The warp is visible here, the two ends are visible here. So I make a cross mark on the first and the second end. Later, in this third and the fourth, the warp ends get covered up by the weft, which we represent by the white, so I leave that blank. Again, it goes under the fifth and the sixth warp end, which means here the two warp ends are visible, so I do a cross on the two warp ends where they are visible. Again, the pick covers up over the two warp ends of the 7th and the 8th, so which means this is a blank. We don't see warp ends here, so I leave a blank here. And the last two warp ends are visible because the pick goes under them. So where they are visible, I put a cross mark again. Now let us look at the second pick. In the second pick, the pick is going over the warp end, so which means it's a blank. Then it goes over the second and the third warp end, it goes under, and we see two warp ends here in brown, and so I put a cross mark here. The second pick now goes over the fourth and the fifth warp end, so we leave a blank because we can't see the warp here. So I leave two blanks here, and then it goes under the sixth and the seventh warp end, and here we see a warp. So we put cross marks here, and then it goes again over the 8th and the 9th warp end, and that means again we don't see the warp here, we leave a blank, and then it goes under the 10th, and here we see the warp that's brown, so that we put a cross mark here. You are slowly seeing how the whole rib is emerging. Let us look at the third pick also. In the third pick, we see it going over the first and the second warp end, so we leave a blank. The third pick then goes under the third and the fourth warp end, so here we see a brown warp, so we put a cross mark here. And then it goes over, the third pick goes over the fifth and the sixth warp end, so which means it covers up the warp and we leave a blank, and then it goes under the 7th and the 8th, so here we see the warp again, so we put a brown cross mark, and then it goes over the 9th and the 10th. Here we see the weft, we don't see the warp here, so we leave a blank. So this is how the way the twill weave emerges. This is a kind of weave where we see floats, which means the fabric is able to drape better because of the kind of interlacing that goes into it. And there are many derivations of this weave where sometimes we have the weft going over 3 warp ends, or it's going over 4 warp ends, or you even can create a pointed rib kind of structure. So this is a very basic twill weave where you have 2 threads going up and 2 threads going down. It's called 2 by 2 twill weave structure.
3, 2, 1, go.
Let us look at the fourth pick now. In the fourth pick, we see the weft going under the first warp end. So we see a brown warp here. So in the fourth pick, I put a brown cross mark. The weft then goes over the second and the third end, that the second and the third warp end. So it's going over it. We see the weft here. So we leave a blank, 2 blanks. The fourth pick then goes under the fourth and the fifth warp end. So we see warp here. So we put fourth and the fifth cross mark. From there the weft goes over the sixth and the seventh warp end. So there you have a blank, and then it goes under the 8th and the 9th. So we see we have an exposed warp ends here. So we put a cross mark again after leaving a blank, and then in the last end we see that the fourth pick is going over the 10th warp end, and we see a weft here. So we leave a blank. Now if you see this, a diagonal rib has emerged. So for us, what happens here is that this is the repeat of that follows. This is the final weave structure. This is the block of repeat that you will repeat time and again. And this will later keep moving forward, and we'll see these ribs forming. And these ribs we see very frequently in our denims. This is a structure which is very sturdy. That's why it's used in fabrics like denims, because the stains don't stay for long, unlike the plain weave. We have understood how twill weave structure works in this diagram, and we plotted a graph of how the twill weave forms this diagonal rib structure. Now let us see how these diagonals are actually visible when we weave with paper strips. So I have used brown color paper strips for the warp, a dark brown color paper strip for the warp, and white paper strips for the weft, each of 1/2 inch width. So let us look at the first pick. The first pick has 2 brown warps on the top, 2 warp ends, next 2 warp ends getting covered by the white weft, and again 2 warp ends are exposed. Again they are covered by the weft and exposed out. So let us look at that. So first we have our 2 warp ends exposed, so we keep them on the top. Then they get covered up by the weft, so we have a float here, so I leave the white. Again I pick up 2 warp ends, again leave 2 which is covered by the weft, and pick up 2 again. So this is my first pick. Now let us look at the second pick. In the second pick, the first end is blank, which means it's covered by the weft, and then you have 2 warp ends exposed, and then again you have the same float of 2 weft, and then 2 warp ends and 2 weft. So we put our first one, which is a blank, then we have the 2 warp ends going up, Then we have two warp ends getting covered by the weft. Then we have two going up, and then you have two covered again by the weft, and then you have this. So you can see how a ladder, a progressive ladder step is building up. Let us look at the third pick. In the third pick, you have two blanks. The weft is covering the first two warp ends. Then you have two exposed warp. Then again two warp ends covered by the weft, and then it follows. So we'll start with two weft, floats, then two warp ends, exposed, then again the two covered by the weft, again two warp ends exposed, and then you have so we are getting now floats, and then you have, let us look at the fourth one. The fourth pick is where you have your first warp end which is exposed, then you have two covered by the weft, and again two warp ends exposed, and it follows. So we have to keep track of the first one where the first warp end is showing up, and then you have two covered, and then you have two and two. And this is how we'll keep weaving. And we see a gradual step structure building up. You can do up to 10 warp ends and 10 picks. You can weave till there to see a complete structure emerging.